You probably think that we are going to discuss a work of fiction tonight. An illusion, as you call it, perhaps. A mirage. Or maybe it's a vision and an ambition. I'm in the latter camp. I'm in the camp of the glass half full instead of half empty. I'm also in the camp of psychology. I think we are lacking self-confidence in Europe. And I think we are often unaware of the extent to which the EU has already changed. And that was the premise of the book when it started, which was written before the elections, and was inspired by the realization that the world had changed very profoundly, and that was an existential problem for the EU, because the EU was reflecting the world before. The world of free trade, of globalization, of democracy, human rights, multilateralism, a world in which it was very comfortable to be the EU, to be even a role model globally, a role model of soft power, and a preacher of soft power. That was a very good place to be for the EU. And when all that turns topsy-turvy, the EU, instead of a model, becomes a target, literally a target. And that is a shock to the system. The shock to the system has generated, in the last Commission, since actually the pandemic really, but mostly since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, a real, by European standards, tsunami of new interventions. And the accumulation of the trust of that gives me the conviction that Superpower Europe is being built as we speak, even though we might not realize it. And for me, that is three fundamental changes in the EU of old that we need to be aware of. They are not necessarily complete. We do not necessarily see them swiftly in action every day, but they are the emerging new EU for me. I'll be very brief, so I'll give you flavors. This flavor, for the people who are familiar with the EU will know this. This is the map of the European political community that was created in 2022. That was an idea of Macron to say we need to do something to respond to the reality that we have a threat on our continent. And that reflects, in my view, a fundamental shift in the basic mission purpose of the EU. For our entire history of post-war integration in Europe, that eventually became the EU, we have essentially been an inward-looking project, where we decided among European like-minded nations, how do we get along? The rest of the world is not so threatening, is either stable or is open, depending on the period, the Cold War or the globalization period. How do we get along? And the people that want to join, they come begging on their knees to join. That was our position. Now it's the opposite. We need to become an outward-looking project, saying what is going to be our geostrategic footprint on the Eurasian continent, and that you see all in the same blue here. Which means that countries like Turkey are there, Ukraine is there, even Crimea. That might be fiction, I don't know. We'll see in due course. But even the UK, for those of you who are still hungover from Brexit, Brexit is partly finished to the extent that it is the European political community's aspiration, which is essentially security and safety on this Eurasian continent. To the extent that that is the trust, the Brits are back already. And we need them, and they realize it that they are needed and they need us as well. This might seem like far-fetched and maybe this is going to take a long time and so on. We'll see what happens in Ukraine. Obviously, that's going to be the big next question, Mark. But this is very much alive, day to day. This is the issue of Moldova. It is the issue of the destination of the Balkans. It is the issue of Georgia, which probably, if we didn't have all the rest happening in the world, particularly Syria and stuff, this would probably be the #1 priority for the EU today, Georgia, because they are going through their Maidan moment as we speak here tonight. This is what it's about for the EU, whether or not it will be able to project a certain pooling power that will bring in these countries into the European sphere, and therefore no longer in a position of them begging us, but is us in a position of offering a value proposition that they cannot refuse. That's the geostrategic EU. Second big transformation is obviously that the EU that was set up to deal with an open world and a peaceful world is now an EU that has to deal with a world of conflict and a world where you have to erect and protect borders. That is extremely hard for the EU to do. We shouldn't underestimate the fact that the world has turned upside down, what a challenge that is politically and operationally for the EU that is set up for the opposite world. But notwithstanding that, we have achieved a deal on migration. It needs to be implemented. Delivery is part of the challenge. We'll see how it works on the ground. Notwithstanding that, once you agree that you have common borders to the outside world, that you need a common policy to protect, you actually are saying a big chunk of international relations and foreign affairs is actually EU. Without us having a vote on it, changing treaties or anything, that's just happening. And the same goes for defense. We can all lament, and we rightly should lament, that this is going too slow, and it's not enough, and so on and so forth. The big thing is that it is happening, and it will continue to happen. And if the scenario in Ukraine worsens, it will, unfortunately, happen even faster. So the world of hard power, the world of geopolitics, is now the mission of the EU. That's the second big transformation. Geopolitics, and perhaps that was the most kind of day-to-day of the emerging new EU in the recent years. Because what you see here on the slide is the reflection of the world that globalization gave us. The fact that energy, technology, trade, finance, and so on were integrated international supply chains. And all of a sudden, this is no longer possible because some of the countries in the supply chain are at war with you, in a hot war, or in a hybrid war, or in a cold war, the three at the same time. And therefore, everything that used to be trade, technology, finance, and so on, all of a sudden becomes intimately geopolitical. Economics is conditional to geopolitics, or it's weaponized in a conflict of some kinds. And that is the big kind of shift that the European Commission has been able to take, much more swifter than the other changes of the EU, because that was already lying in terms of decision-making power with the European Commission. Obviously with the support of the member states, who have been able to shift gears. And in the book I have a list of everything, dozens of things that actually have happened in the past couple of years. And referring to the reports that came out, whether it's Draghi or it's Letta, it's about accelerating this and deepening this in one way or the other. I'm almost there, if this still works. Yeah. The driving force of this fundamental kind of reinvention of what the EU is for is fear. This is not the product of a grand vision or a political consensus. It is the product of us realizing that we have to react together, as Benjamin Franklin put it in the American Revolution. We have to hang together or we hang separately. That's the driving force. The fear factor has gone up with Trump, because now all of a sudden we need to make a fist in all these areas where China and Russia is also making a fist. And since Trump won, America was making a fist, and Biden, who inherited protectionism, added nationalism. And now maybe we get even worse. And so the reality is that we're probably fighting three different fights at the same time. That's the reality for the next couple of years for Europe. That's not a very positive view. But it is realism that should drive us forward. I think we have a few choices to make, and I'll end with that. The choices to pursue or the issues that we need to acknowledge. First off, are we serious? Are we serious about geostrategy and buffers and countries and projecting power? If so, then we need to do something that is not the traditional way of having members join the EU. Enlargement, traditional enlargement, will never achieve that. So the European political community will probably then have to be kind of go to one level higher. I make some suggestions in the book about how we could reinvent membership. That's hard because there you would need to change treaties, and that's a distraction politically. We are in a race which is unfortunately to some extent a zero-sum race, contrary to globalization, which was a win-win race. The zero-sum race between Brussels, Beijing, Washington. And Brussels cannot compete with Beijing and Washington because it doesn't have the federal political power concentrated and it doesn't have the budget power concentrated. So there is a need to make Brussels work as best as possible, which is about efficiency, delivery, and so on. I just wrote a tweet from Donald Trump coming here, was reported in the Financial Times, Charles, saying that he had declared everybody who wants to invest at least $1 billion in the US under my presidency, you get a fast track for everything. We cut to have all the red tape, and Musk was doing that. Yeah, this is what we need in Europe. Mr. Draghi should not be writing a report. Mr. Draghi should be presiding over a committee doing that. Cutting through the red tape and turning it into action on the ground. We need funding in the EU. There used to be a saying about the EU called the Juncker's curse. The European politicians know what they do. They don't know how to get re-elected once they've done it. That was Juncker in 2007. Today we have what I would call von der Leyen's curse. We know what to do. All these reports, we've never had that many reports. We know what to do. We just don't know how to pay for it. So we need to find ways of pooling resources. There are all kinds of clever ways that you can do that. There is no shortage of creativity around Brussels to find money. There are some political obstacles. The key thing for me is that we have to get out of the rat race of state subsidies. That is detrimental. It's never going to create European scale, and it will destroy the politics between member states because it is protectionism within the EU. So how do we do that? You have to create pools of money at EU level or transnational level. Doesn't necessarily have to be 27, quite the contrary. I think you would have to focus on certain clusters and do that transnationally, in my opinion. I would call that the Airbus model. And at the same time, and that's the Letta report, use your market. Use the market, integrate the market, and create scale through that. And do that at speed. Is that possible? Is that not possible? We'll see. If we are in a fighting match, in a box match, and we need to box, then we have to have a strategy. Mike Tyson said everybody has a plan until we get kicked in the teeth. And so we are getting kicked in the teeth and we need a plan. Can we get a plan? That's a question I have. We've never been very good at geopolitics on the EU continent, except for France perhaps. The UK is a traditional geopolitical actor, is a half in, half out. Germany for me is a real question. I have high hopes for the German election in February, and I hope that Germany can mentally turn the page on the 20th century and become a geopolitical force, because we need it. I think that's what's holding us back. I'm very optimistic about the eastern part of Europe, Poland and a few other countries, the Baltics, the Scandinavians. I'm very optimistic. It's a different Europe, actually, than the ones we are sitting here tonight. Defense, that's going to come, because it has to come. The challenge here is that we have to do so many things at once. Yes, we have to raise the contributions to NATO. Yes, we have to keep funding the Ukrainian war effort. And at the same time, we have to develop a midterm autonomous European capacity. These three things at the same time. How are we going to do that, and who is going to do that? I think the solution lies in my last suggestion. The EU never been set up to work as a centralized power, has succeeded in taking a lot of steps in a very short time, but not fast enough compared to the competition, as Paul rightly said, and has done that remarkably so with 27 countries. Remarkable. We should really say hats off in terms of political creativity and diplomatic effort. But that's not good enough anymore. We need to go beyond that. And it's become harder to do so politically than before. Because politically, internally in the EU, domestically and so on, things have become more complicated on a number of levels. So that is the big challenge. And the challenge is that big because the new EU is much more political than the old EU as well. It deals with issues that are really front and center of domestic politics. The old EU was technocratic. Market management, trade management, standards. Now it's really the heart of politics that lies, has become geopolitics. And on the table in Brussels. So that's very hard to do because it brings these central themes to the European level. The diversity within member states becomes a bigger problem as well. Geography, history, identity become a bigger issue than before. So the political challenge is really big. I don't have a crystal ball and I don't have a miracle cure for it. I give some suggestions in the book of what could help accelerate it. I'm a believer in the fact that we could have coalitions of the willing, particularly in issues of clustering of economic development, technological development, defense spending, infrastructure, energy transition, these type of things. If we can get the Airbus model there, multiplied somehow in a few ways with a variety of initiatives. Financial Times, again, I think is the only newspaper that covered it. Early December mentioned that a group of countries is building a 500 billion euro defense fund. A group of countries, including the UK. Yeah, that would help the European challenge. So I believe in this type of progress, and I think it's going to accelerate. Politics is messy. It's messy everywhere. We are very easily very negative about politics in the EU, while the EU is 27 times more complicated than domestic politics, which is already a mess. So I think we should be self-confident that we can actually do certain things. It's never going to be perfection. My last remark is that I'm originally a lawyer. And I've been involved in EU stuff for over 25 years. And as a lawyer, you get this nice mental template imprinted on your brain, which is a Cartesian template. It says, it's either EU competence or it's state competence. And that's how the world works. And this distinction is completely gone. If you want the EU to function, it is a combination of the EU level and the member state level at the same time. And including these clusters of member states. And that is the reason why our little think tank based in Brussels is going to try to build connections with other think tanks in other capitals and member states where we think we need to have a bottom-up dynamic towards Europe as well, because it's these two things together that will make the Europe that we desperately need. I thank you.